Good evening, and welcome back to Bedtime Historian. Have you ever stood at the base of the Great Pyramid at Giza and wondered who the man was, who ordered something so enormous, built something that has outlasted every empire since, yet whose own voice we barely hear across 4,500 years? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're listening tonight, drop a quick comment with your location and the local time where you are right now. It's always interesting to see where everyone is winding down together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Khufu was born in the early years of what we now call the 4th dynasty, roughly 2589 BCE, though the ancient Egyptians themselves did not number their dynasties or count years the way we do. They measured time by the reigns of kings and the annual rising of the Nile. His father was Sneferu, already an experienced ruler who had spent decades consolidating power after the turbulent end of the 3rd dynasty. His mother was Hetepheres I, a woman whose name means she who is satisfied with her Horus, a quiet indication of her status as a principal wife whose lineage tied the royal house to the gods. The family resided mostly in Memphis, the administrative heart of the kingdom, a sprawling city of whitewashed mud brick houses, narrow streets shaded by date palms, and the constant smell of river mud and baking bread. Khufu entered the world in one of the royal residences near the riverbank, probably during the inundation season when the fields were underwater and the whole country paused to celebrate the gift of fertile silt. Newborns in Egypt were kept close to their mothers for the first few years. Wet nurses and female attendants handled most of the daily care, while the queen recovered and resumed her duties in the palace. As the 2nd or possibly 3rd son records are silent, on the exact order Khufu was not. Immediately marked as the heir, older brothers carried that weight at first. Still, he grew up inside the same sheltered world they did. Rooms cooled by thick walls and reed mats, meals of flat bread, lentils, onions, garlic, and roasted duck or pigeon, served on low tables while servants moved quietly in linen kilts and simple bead collars. The air carried the faint smoke of incense from morning offerings and the distant lowing of cattle being driven to market. Children of the royal household were not raised in isolation. They played in courtyards where fountains trickled and sycamore trees offered shade. Toys included wooden boats, balls made of linen wound tight, and small faience figures of animals. Khufu would have watched older siblings practice archery with miniature bows or listened to musicians playing harps and sistra during evening gatherings. Servants told stories of the gods, how Osiris was restored, how Horus avenged his father, stories that were never just entertainment, but lessons in kingship and the order of the world. The palace itself was a living organism. Scribes moved through corridors carrying papyrus rolls, reporting grain yields or the arrival of cedar logs from Byblos. Priests in leopard skin cloaks performed daily rituals in small chapels to keep the principle of truth, balance, justice intact. Everyone understood that the pharaoh was more than a man. He was the bridge between the human world and the divine. Even as a toddler, Khufu would have been carried to watch his father receive foreign envoys or inspect cattle herds, small events that taught the lesson early. Power rested on visible prosperity and the favour of the gods. By the time he could walk steadily, attendants began teaching him the shapes of hieroglyphs not yet to read fluently, but to recognize the signs for king, sun, Nile, bread. The language was everywhere, carved on door lintels, painted on offering tables, spoken in formal greetings. Khufu's earliest memories likely included the sound of his mother's voice reciting prayers at dawn and the sight of his father's officials bowing low whenever Sneferu passed. The kingdom he was born into was unusually stable. Sneferu had already built 2 large pyramids at Darsha, learning from earlier mistakes how to construct stable monuments on a grand scale. His expeditions to the Sinai brought copper, turquoise, and malachite. Ships returned from the Levant loaded with cedar for temple doors and boat hulls. Grain silos were full, the army was disciplined, and the bureaucracy functioned smoothly under viziers who reported directly to the king. For a royal child, this meant security. Regular meals, clean linen clothing changed often, and the certainty that tomorrow would resemble today. Yet even in this calm there were undercurrents. Succession was never automatic. Brothers could become rivals. Half-siblings born to lesser wives sometimes pressed claims. Khufu's early years passed in a world where affection was genuine but tempered by politics. His mother, Hetepheres, maintained her own small court, complete with stewards and ladies-in-waiting, and she would have made sure her sons understood their place in the larger family network. Around age 5 or 6, the difference between royal children and others became more pronounced. Common boys of the same age were already helping fathers in fields or workshops. Royal boys began formal training. Khufu was fitted with a sidelock of youth, the single braid on the side of an otherwise shaved head, and started spending part of each day with tutors selected from the scribal and priestly class. These men were patient but firm, aware that the child before them might one day hold the titles Lord of the Two Lands and Son of Ra. The Nile shaped everything. Each year it rose, flooded the Black Land, then receded, leaving behind the richest soil in the known world. The inundation was a festival time. People danced, drank barley beer, offered thanks at small local shrines. Khufu would have been taken to watch boats decorated with flowers sailing past Memphis, carrying images of Hapi, the god of the flood. These were not abstract ceremonies to him. They were part of the rhythm that fed the kingdom and kept his family in power. By the time he reached 7 or 8, he could already distinguish the different ranks of officials by their clothing and titles. The vizier in his long kilt and broad collar, the overseers of works in simpler linen, the foreign traders permitted into the palace only under guard. He learned which gods were closest to the throne, Ra at Heliopolis, Ptah at Memphis, Hathor in many forms, and why maintaining their temples mattered as much as maintaining the army. His father's reign provided the backdrop for these lessons. Sneferu was not a distant figure. He appeared regularly in the palace, inspecting building models, listening to reports from the provinces, sometimes even sitting with his younger children while musicians played. Khufu watched how his father balanced firmness with generosity, rewarding loyal nomarchs with titles and land, punishing corruption swiftly but without public spectacle. These were the habits of rule that the boy absorbed long before he understood their full meaning. The royal children also learned the physical demands of kingship. They practiced running along palace corridors, learned to handle a light bow, rode small donkeys under supervision. Strength and endurance mattered. A weak pharaoh invited challenge. Khufu grew tall for his time, with the lean build typical of the elite who ate well but did not overindulge. So his childhood unfolded in a world of order and abundance, where every ritual, every meal, every lesson pointed toward the same truth. The land, the river, the gods, and the king were bound together. To be born into that family was both privilege and burden. Khufu carried it quietly, as boys do, while the Pyramid Age gathered momentum around him. As Khufu grew from a small boy into a more aware child, the palace in Memphis became the center of his entire world. The structure itself was vast, with multiple courtyards connected by columned halls and shaded walkways. Walls were thick to keep out the heat, painted in soft earth tones, and decorated with scenes of the king offering to the gods. Servants moved through these spaces constantly, carrying water jars, fresh linens, or trays of food. Their footsteps were quiet on the packed earth floors covered with reed mats. Each day followed a steady pattern. The household woke early, just as the sun rose over the eastern desert. Young Khufu was helped by attendants to wash with water scented lightly with myrrh. He wore a simple linen kilt that reached to his knees and went barefoot most of the time inside the palace grounds. During the cooler months, a light cloak might be added, but in the heat of summer the clothing stayed minimal. His head was shaved except for the youth sidelock, which was carefully braided each morning. Breakfast consisted of fresh bread baked that morning, soft cheese, figs, and sometimes a thin porridge made from barley. These meals were eaten in a private family room where his mother Hetepheres presided. Siblings joined them, both full brothers and sisters, as well as children from his father's other wives. The atmosphere was calm but never entirely relaxed. Rank was always observed, even among children. Older brothers received slightly larger portions and first choice of seating. Khufu learned early to accept his place without complaint. The palace staff numbered in the hundreds. There were specific roles for everyone: cupbearers who tasted food for safety, fan-bearers who kept air moving during the hottest hours, nurses who still watched over the younger children. Khufu had his own small group of attendants who stayed close but never overstepped. They taught him simple manners: how to hold a cup, how to greet an official of high rank with the proper slight bow. These lessons came through daily repetition rather than formal lectures. Outside the private quarters lay the larger court. Here Khufu occasionally saw his father Sneferu conducting business. The king would sit on a raised platform under a canopy, while scribes read reports from the provinces. Grain storage figures, cattle counts, and news of successful mining expeditions were common topics. The young prince stood quietly at the side during some of these sessions, absorbing how decisions were made and how carefully words were chosen. Memphis itself pressed right up against the palace walls. From the upper terraces, Khufu could look out over the city. Narrow streets wound between houses of 2 and 3 stories. The smell of baking bread and frying fish drifted up on the breeze. Donkeys brayed as they carried loads of vegetables to market. Along the riverfront, boats unloaded goods from upstream: granite from Aswan, wine jars from the delta. The prince was sometimes taken on short, supervised walks through parts of the city, always accompanied by guards and officials. These trips showed him the lives of ordinary Egyptians who worked in workshops making pottery, tools, or fine jewellery for the elite. His siblings formed an important part of daily life. There were several brothers who competed in games of skill. They threw sticks at targets or practiced with small throwing nets used for catching birds in the marshes. Sisters spent more time learning household skills and music. All the royal children participated in religious observances together, carrying small offerings to household shrines or watching priests perform morning rituals for the family's patron gods. These shared moments created bonds, even if political considerations always hovered in the background. As the years passed, Khufu began to notice differences in how people treated him compared to other boys. Servants addressed him with extra respect. When he asked for something, it was usually provided quickly. This attention made him thoughtful. He developed the habit of watching quietly before speaking, a trait that would stay with him. He enjoyed simple pleasures: the taste of honey-sweetened cakes during festivals, the cool feel of the river breeze in the evening, the sound of musicians practicing in the palace gardens. Food in the palace reflected the kingdom's wealth. Besides basic bread and vegetables, there were dates, grapes, pomegranates when in season, and meat from cattle raised on royal estates. Fish from the Nile was common, grilled or dried. Beer, lightly fermented, was drunk by everyone, even children, though watered down. Special meals marked important days, such as the anniversary of the king's coronation or successful returns of expeditions. Clothing changed with age and occasion. For daily wear, Khufu used plain white linen. On festival days, he might receive a kilt with gold thread or a collar of colourful beads. These items were stored in wooden chests, cared for by dedicated servants. The prince learned to appreciate quality materials: linen that was soft rather than scratchy, beads that were smoothly polished. Education continued through observation and gentle guidance. Scribes sometimes demonstrated how they mixed ink and wrote on papyrus. Khufu practiced making simple signs himself on broken pieces of pottery. He learned the names of different districts in Egypt and the titles held by important men. The goal was not speed, but accuracy and understanding of order. Everything in Egyptian life, he was shown, had its proper place. The seasons brought variety to palace routines. During the inundation months, when fields were flooded, more time was spent indoors with stories and games. When the water receded, everyone celebrated the return of planting season. Khufu watched processions where priests carried statues of the gods through the streets while people scattered flowers and offered prayers for a good harvest. These events reminded him that the prosperity of the palace depended on the labour of farmers far beyond the city walls. As he approached his teenage years, Khufu began joining his father on short trips along the Nile. They visited nearby temples and inspected royal estates where cattle and grain were managed. The prince saw how carefully the land was divided and how officials kept records of every sack of wheat. These journeys expanded his understanding beyond the palace compound. He noticed the respect people showed his father and started to sense the heavy responsibility that came with being part of the royal line. Back in Memphis, the daily rhythm continued. Evenings often brought music. Harpists and flutists performed while the family rested. Khufu developed a quiet appreciation for these sounds. They marked the peaceful close of another day in a kingdom that his family was expected to protect. Servants lit oil lamps as darkness fell, and the palace settled into quiet until the next dawn. Through all these experiences, Khufu absorbed the unwritten rules of royal life. One did not show excessive emotion. One listened more than one spoke. One honoured the gods before all else. These principles were not taught in single lessons, but woven into every hour spent inside the palace walls. The boy who would one day become pharaoh was forming his character in this steady, ordered environment, surrounded by the constant activity of servants, the presence of siblings, and the living pulse of Memphis itself. Lessons of a young Prince Khufu reached an age when palace routines gave way to more structured training. Around 10 years old, the sidelock of youth remained, but his days filled with purposeful activities designed to prepare him for possible rule. The tutors chosen for him came from the scribal and priestly classes, men who had spent decades mastering the knowledge needed to serve the king. They approached their task with calm authority, knowing the boy before them carried royal blood. Reading and writing occupied much of the morning. Khufu sat on a low stool in a shaded room open to the courtyard breeze. Before him lay a wooden board coated with fresh whitewash, a reed pen, and a small palette holding black and red ink. The first lessons focused on recognition rather than composition. He learned to identify the basic signs: the seated man for man, the loaf of bread for the sound T, the water ripple for N. Tutors spoke the sounds clearly and pointed to the corresponding hieroglyph. Progress moved slowly. Accuracy mattered more than speed. Mistakes were corrected without anger, simply erased and redone. By the time he could copy short words reliably, the lessons expanded to short phrases used in official documents. Life, prosperity, health, after the king's name, or may he live forever. Khufu practiced these daily until the shapes flowed naturally from his hand. The tutors explained that writing was power records kept the kingdom running, from grain tallies to temple inventories. A future pharaoh needed to understand what the scribes presented to him. Beyond the writing board came instruction in numbers and measurement. Egyptians used a base 10 system with special signs for tens, hundreds, thousands. Khufu learned to count using knotted cords or small stones arranged in rows. Tutors showed him how surveyors measured fields after the flood receded, stretching ropes marked at regular intervals. They demonstrated simple calculations: how much grain a certain area would yield, how many loaves could feed a work crew. These exercises were practical. The prince saw their direct connection to feeding the people and supplying offerings to the gods. Ritual knowledge formed another major part of his education. Priests from the nearby temple of Ptah visited regularly. They taught Khufu the sequence of morning offerings, the lighting of incense, the presentation of bread and beer, the recitation of fixed formulas that pleased the deity. He learned the proper way to hold the incense burner and the gestures that accompanied each step. These acts were not mere ceremony, they maintained the balance of the world. The tutors stressed that neglect of the gods brought chaos, drought, disease, rebellion. Khufu absorbed this lesson deeply, carrying it forward as a core duty. Observation of the Nile cycles came next. Each year, the river rose, peaked, and fell in a pattern the Egyptians had tracked for centuries. Priests kept records of flood heights using Nilometer's staircases cut into the riverbank with marks showing high and low levels. Khufu was taken to see one during the inundation season. Standing on the steps, he watched the dark water climb higher each day, covering the fields in a sheet of brown. When it receded, the black soil left behind supported abundant crops. He learned the names of the 3 seasons: inundation, emergence, harvest. Each had its own rhythm of work and festival. The tutors used these observations to teach broader principles. The Nile was a gift from Hapi, but its behaviour depended on cosmic order. The pharaoh's role was to uphold Ma'at, so the river continued its reliable pattern. Khufu heard stories of past rulers who had failed in this duty and suffered the consequences: famine, unrest. The message was clear. Personal conduct affected the entire land. Physical training complemented the intellectual work. In the palace grounds, instructors taught basic archery. Khufu drew a small bow made of acacia wood, aimed at straw targets, and released reed arrows fletched with feathers. Accuracy improved with practice. Strength came from repeated drawing. He also learned to throw javelins and handle a short staff. These skills prepared him for both hunting and the possibility of leading troops, though Egypt at this time relied more on deterrence than frequent war. Hunting trips provided practical application. During the cooler months, the royal family organised outings to the desert fringes or marshlands. Khufu rode in a chariot driven by an experienced charioteer, holding onto the side rail as the vehicle bounced over uneven ground. They pursued gazelle or fowl with throw sticks and nets. These excursions were partly sport, partly training in endurance and quick judgment. The prince returned dusty and tired, but satisfied with the day's catch. Religious festivals offered another layer of learning. At the annual Feast of Opet, or local celebrations honouring Ptah, Khufu joined processions that carried the god statue through Memphis streets. He walked behind his father, carrying a small standard or fan. Crowds pressed close, chanting and throwing flowers. The prince saw how the people responded to the presence of the royal family cheers mixed with awe. These moments showed him the emotional bond between ruler and ruled. Daily life in the palace continued to shape his habits. He ate simple, regular meals: bread, onions, cucumbers, occasionally fish or meat. Water came from jars filtered through porous clay. He slept on a low bed with a wooden headrest and linen sheets. Evenings brought quiet time, listening to stories from older family members or watching the stars appear above the courtyard. The tutors introduced basic astronomy. They pointed out the Deccan stars that rose at different times to mark the hours of night. Khufu learned to recognize Sirius, whose heliacal rising signaled the coming inundation. This knowledge helped priests time rituals and farmers plan planting. The prince understood that the sky, like the Nile, followed predictable patterns the king must respect. As training intensified, Khufu spent less time in unstructured play. His siblings noticed the shift. Older brothers received similar lessons, younger ones still enjoyed more freedom. Competition existed quietly, each child aware that favour depended on ability and behaviour. Khufu responded by applying himself steadily. He asked precise questions and listened carefully to answers. The lessons extended to court etiquette. He practiced the correct way to approach officials of different ranks. A deeper bow for the vizier, a slight nod for lesser overseers. He learned the formal phrases used in greetings and reports. These details mattered. A misstep could signal disrespect and weaken authority. By his mid-teens, Khufu could read short inscriptions, perform basic calculations, recite key offering formulas, and handle weapons with competence. More importantly, he had internalized the central idea. The pharaoh existed to maintain order. Every skill, every piece of knowledge served that purpose. The tutors saw steady progress and reported it to Sneferu. The king, occupied with his own building projects, still found time to review these accounts and occasionally summon his son for brief discussions. Through all this training, Khufu remained thoughtful and reserved. He watched the world around him, the servants' quiet efficiency, the priests' careful movements, the people's trust in the royal house, and understood his place within it. The lessons of a young prince were not abstract. They were the foundation of a life that would one day carry the weight of an entire civilization. Father Sneferu's influence Khufu entered his later teenage years while Sneferu was still firmly on the throne, and the prince spent increasing amounts of time in his father's presence. Sneferu had already ruled for several decades by this point, long enough to leave a clear mark on the kingdom. His reign stood out for the scale of construction he undertook and the way he managed the resources needed to support it. Khufu watched these efforts up close and began to see what sustained royal power over time. Sneferu maintained 2 major pyramid complexes during the years Khufu was coming of age. The first attempts at Dashur had taught hard lessons about structural stability. The initial large pyramid there developed noticeable bends in its sides partway up, forcing the builders to reduce the angle to prevent collapse. Sneferu ordered work to continue anyway, then started a second pyramid nearby with a corrected, gentler slope from the beginning. This second structure stood true and reached completion. Khufu visited the site several times, travelling by boat along the Nile and then by donkey across the desert fringe. He saw the ramps still in place, the sledges used to move blocks, and the careful levelling of foundations. These visits showed him that even a king could adjust plans when nature demanded it. The workforce for these projects drew from across Egypt. During the inundation season, when fields were underwater and farm labour paused, thousands of men arrived at the building sites. They came in organised teams, each group responsible for a specific task: quarrying, transporting, setting stones. Khufu observed how overseers assigned shifts, distributed rations of bread, beer and onions, and kept records of attendance on ostraca. The men lived in temporary villages near the pyramids, with bakeries, breweries and medical facilities. Injuries were treated promptly, broken bones were set, wounds cleaned with honey. Sneferu made sure these workers were fed and cared for, understanding that a well-treated labour force worked more efficiently and complained less. Khufu also saw the logistical side of these enterprises. The Nile served as the main highway. Barges carried limestone from Tura quarries downstream to the pyramid sites. Granite for inner chambers came from Aswan, hundreds of miles south, floated on large rafts during high water. Cedar beams arrived from the Levant, cut in the forests of Byblos and shipped across the sea. The prince learned how officials negotiated with foreign traders, offering grain or linen in exchange for timber. These dealings kept the kingdom supplied without draining its reserves. Sneferu led military expeditions as well, though they were limited in scope. One major campaign targeted the Sinai Peninsula to secure copper and turquoise mines. Khufu accompanied his father on at least one such journey, travelling with a column of troops and supply trains. The force moved through the eastern desert, following established routes with water stops. At the mining sites, local workers extracted ore under Egyptian supervision. The expedition returned with loaded donkeys and guarded carts. Sneferu displayed the spoils publicly in Memphis copper ingots, polished turquoise beads reinforcing the image of a ruler who brought wealth home. Back in the capital, Sneferu spent time reviewing administration. He met regularly with the vizier and department heads who managed taxes, labour and temple estates. Khufu sat in on some of these sessions, positioned quietly to the side. He heard discussions about grain collection from the nomes, the appointment of new nomarchs, and the inspection of canal maintenance. Sneferu listened to reports without hurry, asked pointed questions, and issued decisions that were recorded immediately. The prince noticed how his father balanced firmness with fairness, punishing embezzlement harshly, but rewarding competence with titles and land grants. Religious duties took up considerable time. Sneferu visited temples frequently, especially the Sun Temple at Heliopolis and the Ptah complex in Memphis. Khufu joined him on several occasions. They arrived by river, disembarked at temple quays, and walked processional ways lined with sphinxes. Inside the sanctuaries, The king presented offerings while priests chanted. The air was thick with incense smoke and the low hum of voices. Khufu carried small ritual items or simply observed. These visits reminded him that the pharaoh's authority rested on divine approval as much as on military or economic strength. The royal family remained close-knit despite its size. Sneferu had multiple wives, and children from different mothers lived in the palace compound. Khufu interacted regularly with his full siblings and half-siblings. Shared meals occurred most evenings, large trays of food placed on mats, with the king at the head. Conversation stayed light, focused on the day's events or upcoming festivals. Sneferu spoke to his sons about practical matters, the importance of loyal officials, the need to keep temples stocked, the value of accurate records. These talks were never lectures. They arose naturally during meals or walks in the garden. Khufu began to take on small responsibilities. His father occasionally sent him to inspect storehouses or oversee the unloading of boats. These tasks were minor but meaningful. They gave the prince direct contact with the kingdom's workings. He reported back to Sneferu in private audiences, learning how to present information clearly and concisely. The king listened attentively, offered corrections when needed, and praised thoroughness. Khufu developed a habit of double-checking details before speaking. The kingdom under Sneferu appeared prosperous. Fields produced surplus grain after good floods. Cattle herds grew on royal domains. Artisans crafted fine goods, gold jewellery, alabaster vessels, furniture inlaid with ivory. Trade flowed steadily. Foreign envoys arrived with tribute, and Egyptian officials travelled abroad to maintain relations. Khufu saw delegations from Nubia bringing ebony and leopard skins, from Punt with myrrh and incense. Each arrival reinforced the central role of the pharaoh in connecting Egypt to the wider world. As Sneferu aged, his building focus shifted. He planned a third pyramid, this time at Midam, farther north. Khufu travelled there to see the early stages foundation levelling, quarry preparation. The site was chosen for its visibility across the floodplain. Workers began laying courses using lessons learned at Dashur. Sneferu visited periodically, consulting architects and adjusting designs. Khufu watched how his father remained engaged even as years accumulated, never delegating entirely. Through these experiences, Khufu absorbed a practical model of kingship. Sneferu showed that rule required constant attention to detail: resources, people, gods, borders. He demonstrated that mistakes could be corrected, that persistence mattered, that prosperity depended on organisation. The prince carried these observations quietly. He did not yet speak of them openly, but they shaped his thinking about what his own reign might demand. Sneferu's influence extended beyond projects and expeditions. He maintained personal discipline, rising early, eating moderately, listening more than speaking. Khufu noticed these habits and began adopting similar ones. The king also showed generosity toward loyal servants, granting them tombs near his own pyramid. This practice strengthened allegiance throughout the court. Khufu saw how such gestures created lasting bonds. By the time Khufu reached his early 20s, he had spent years observing a ruler who combined vision with pragmatism. Sneferu had turned the lessons of earlier dynasties into concrete achievements: stable pyramids, secure frontiers, a well-fed workforce. The prince understood that the throne carried heavy expectations. What he had witnessed was not just a father's daily work, but a living example of how to hold Egypt together. Transition to power Sneferu's long reign drew to a close in a manner typical of the era, quietly, without public spectacle or recorded drama. The king had reached an advanced age, his health gradually declining over several years. One morning, he simply failed to rise for the usual dawn rituals. Palace physicians attended him in his private chambers, but the end came swiftly. Word spread through the corridors in hushed tones. Servants moved with extra care, and officials gathered in the audience hall to await instructions. Khufu, now in his mid-20s, was summoned immediately to his father's bedside. There, in the presence of the Queen Mother Hetepheres and a small circle of trusted advisers, Sneferu transferred the symbols of rule, the crook and flail, the red and white crowns, into the hands of his son. The transfer happened without ceremony, a private acknowledgement that the time had arrived. Within hours, the court scribes began drafting the formal announcements. Messengers departed by boat and chariot to carry word to the gnomes. The transition followed established custom. The new king assumed the throne the moment the old one passed, ensuring no gap in authority. Khufu received the full titulary Horus name, Nebti name, Golden Horus name, and the prenomen Khnum Khufu, meaning Khnum protects me. The name linked him directly to the ram-headed creator god Khnum, who shaped humans on his potter's wheel and controlled the Nile's annual flood. This choice reflected both personal devotion and a deliberate statement of continuity with the cosmic order his father had upheld. The first days after the coronation remained confined to the palace. Khufu wore the double crown in private audiences, its weight unfamiliar on his head. He sat on the raised dais where Sneferu had presided, now listening to the same officials report the same matters: grain levels in the granaries, the state of the canals, the progress on the Maiden Pyramid. The men who had served his father now bowed lower before him, addressing him as Lord of the Two Lands. Khufu spoke little at first, preferring to observe how the court adjusted to the change. He noticed subtle shifts. Some officials grew more deferential, others watched him carefully to gauge his temperament. Public acknowledgement came soon after. A formal coronation procession moved through Memphis. Khufu rode in a carrying chair borne by trusted men, the red crown of Lower Egypt on one side of his head, the white crown of Upper Egypt on the other. Priests walked ahead swinging incense burners. Musicians played trumpets and sistra. Soldiers lined the route. Crowds gathered along the processional way, throwing lotus flowers and chanting praises. The people had known Sneferu as a builder and provider. They now looked at his son with the same mixture of awe and expectation. Khufu kept his expression steady, raising his hand in acknowledgement as the chair passed. The event lasted from dawn until the sun stood high, ending at the temple of Ptah, where offerings were made on behalf of the new king. Once crowned, Khufu faced immediate practical demands. The bureaucracy required confirmation of appointments. He reviewed the list of viziers, treasurers, and overseers his father had left in place. Most retained their positions, a few received promotions or gentle retirements. Loyalty mattered above all. Khufu summoned each high official individually, asking direct questions about their departments and listening closely to the answers. These meetings established his style, measured, attentive, unwilling to accept vague replies. He made no sweeping changes at the outset, preferring stability while he learned the full scope of the machinery he now directed. The royal residences shifted subtly. Khufu moved into the main private apartments previously occupied by Sneferu. The rooms were large, cooled by thick walls and shaded colonnades, furnished with low beds, chests of ebony and ivory, and folding stools. Hetepheres retained her own quarters nearby, still active in court life and consulted regularly by her son. Other family members, brothers, sisters, half-siblings continued their routines, though the centre of gravity had clearly moved to Khufu. Some siblings received new titles or estates, others simply adjusted to the new reality. Daily life acquired new layers of protocol. Khufu rose before dawn for the first rituals. Priests entered his chambers bearing basins of water scented with lotus. He washed, dressed in fresh linen, and proceeded to the small chapel attached to the palace where he offered incense and bread to the rising sun. These acts were personal at first, then public as the day progressed. He ate sparingly bread, fruit, thin beer, while scribes read incoming dispatches. The rest of the morning belonged to audiences. Nomarchs reporting from their provinces, overseers detailing construction progress, priests requesting resources for festivals. One of the earliest decisions concerned the unfinished projects inherited from Sneferu. The Maiden Pyramid stood partway built, its casing not yet complete. Khufu visited the site within weeks of taking the throne. He walked the ramps, examined the courses already laid, and spoke with the chief architect. After studying the plans, he ordered work to continue, but with modifications, additional buttressing to ensure long-term stability. This choice showed continuity rather than rejection of his father's legacy. At the same time, he began considering his own monument. The idea had formed years earlier. Now it became a practical necessity. Khufu understood that a pharaoh's tomb was more than a grave. It was the physical expression of his role as maintainer of Maat. A small or flawed pyramid would signal weakness to both the living and the gods. He therefore instructed surveyors to begin searching for a suitable location near Memphis, one that offered solid bedrock, proximity to the river for transport, and visibility across the floodplain. Teams set out with measuring cords and sighting instruments, marking potential sites on papyrus maps. Court life continued its rhythm. Festivals arrived on schedule: the inundation celebrations, the Feast of the Valley, local temple days. Khufu participated fully, walking in processions, presenting offerings, receiving petitions. He wore ceremonial regalia on these occasions: broad collars of gold and faience, leopard skin cloaks for certain rituals, the bull's tail attached to his kilt as a symbol of strength. The clothing felt heavier than everyday linen, a constant reminder of the role he now embodied. Family dynamics adjusted gradually. His wives, several, as was customary, received increased attention from palace staff. Children born earlier now appeared more often in public settings. Khufu spent evenings with them when duties allowed, watching them play or listening to their lessons. These moments provided balance amid the growing weight of rule. The kingdom itself remained stable. The Nile floods continued their pattern. Granaries stayed full. Trade routes operated without interruption. Yet Khufu felt the difference acutely. Every decision now carried his name. A misstep in resource allocation could affect thousands. A neglected temple might invite divine displeasure. He responded by working longer hours than his father had in later years, reviewing accounts late into the night by lamplight, consulting advisors until the stars wheeled overhead. Through these early months, Khufu proved himself capable. Officials who had served Sneferu found the new king attentive and decisive. The people in the streets heard his name invoked in prayers and saw his image begin to appear on temple reliefs. He was no longer the prince observing from the side. He stood at the centre, bearing the full responsibility of the two lands. The transition, though smooth on the surface, marked a profound personal shift from observer to the one whose word became law. Early, decrees as pharaoh. With the coronation complete and the initial period of adjustment behind him, Khufu turned to the concrete work of governing. The first months on the throne required him to issue a series of decrees that would set the tone for his administration and secure the loyalty of those who ran the kingdom on a daily basis. These early commands were not dramatic overhauls, but careful adjustments that signalled both respect for his father's system and his own emerging priorities. One of the first decrees confirmed the existing appointments in the highest offices. The vizier who had served Sneferu for many years remained in place, as did the treasurer responsible for the central granaries and the overseer of royal works. Khufu summoned each man to a private audience in the palace hall. He asked them to report on the current state of their departments, the amount of grain in storage, the number of cattle on royal estates, the progress of unfinished projects. The conversations were straightforward. He listened without interruption, then asked specific follow-up questions. At the end of each meeting, he gave verbal confirmation of their positions, often adding a small additional grant of land or title to show appreciation. These acts reassured the senior officials that experience and loyalty would continue to be valued. He next addressed the provincial administration. Egypt was divided into nomes administrative districts, each governed by a nomarch appointed by the king. Some nomarchs had held their positions since Sneferu's early years and were growing old. Khufu reviewed the list of current holders and identified several who needed replacement due to age or reported inefficiency. In these cases, he selected successors from families already connected to the court. men who had served in lower capacities and demonstrated competence. The new appointments were announced through sealed papyrus rolls carried by royal couriers. Each new nomarch received a letter outlining his duties: collect taxes in grain and labour fairly, maintain canals and dikes, report any unrest immediately, and ensure temples received their allotted offerings. Khufu made it clear that he expected regular written reports, a practice that strengthened central control. Another early decree concerned the management of labour during the inundation season. The annual flood brought thousands of farmers into temporary service on state projects. Khufu ordered that the recruitment process remain organised by nome, with quotas based on population and land under cultivation. He also specified that workers receive standard rations: bread, beer, onions, garlic, and occasional meat, and that they return to their fields once the water receded. Overseers were instructed to keep detailed records of names, days worked, and rations issued. These measures built on his father's system but added stricter accounting to prevent shortages or favoritism. Khufu paid particular attention to the priesthood. Temples owned large estates and controlled significant resources. He summoned the high priests of the major sanctuaries in Memphis, Heliopolis, and nearby centres. In separate meetings he reviewed their inventories, land holdings, cattle herds, grain stores, and reminded them of their obligation to supply offerings for the royal cult. He increased slightly the allocations for certain festivals, especially those honouring Ra and Ptah, and in return asked for more detailed annual reports on temple income and expenditure. The priests accepted the arrangement. It gave them stability while reinforcing the king's role as chief servant of the gods. He also issued commands related to trade and foreign relations. Expeditions to the Sinai for copper and turquoise continued without interruption. Khufu confirmed the existing agreements with Byblos for cedar shipments and instructed officials to maintain the same exchange rates in grain and linen. When a small delegation from Nubia arrived with tribute ebony, ivory, gold dust, he received them formally, accepted the gifts, and sent back counter-gifts of fine linen and faience beads. These exchanges kept the southern frontier peaceful and the supply of luxury goods steady. Within the palace itself, Khufu reorganized certain routines to suit his working style. He established a daily schedule for receiving reports: mornings for economic and administrative matters, afternoons for religious and construction issues, evenings for private review of documents. Scribes worked in shifts to keep pace with the flow of papyrus. He also ordered that important decrees be recorded in duplicate one copy, kept in the royal archive, another sent to the relevant department or nome. This practice reduced misunderstandings and provided a clear record for future reference. The court felt the change in subtle ways. Khufu spoke less in large gatherings than his father had in later years, preferring concise statements followed by action. When disputes arose between officials, he listened to both sides, then issued a ruling that usually split the difference or favoured the party with stronger evidence. His decisions were prompt but not hasty. He often delayed a final word until the next day so he could consult advisors or review records. This approach earned respect from those who valued consistency over flash. He also began to shape the royal household more directly. Several trusted men from his own circle, childhood attendants who had risen through the ranks, received new responsibilities. One became overseer of the palace guard, another handled the distribution of royal gifts. These appointments balanced the old guard with younger men, loyal primarily to Khufu. The shift was gradual. No one was dismissed outright, but the centre of influence tilted slightly toward the new king's generation. Construction projects received early attention. Beyond continuing the Maiden Pyramid, Khufu ordered surveys of possible sites for his own monument. Teams of surveyors, equipped with sighting rods and water levels, travelled the west bank of the Nile near Memphis. They tested soil stability, measured distances to the river, and noted elevations. Preliminary reports came back within weeks, listing several promising plateaus. Khufu studied the maps and models brought to him, asking questions about flood risk, quarry access, and visibility from the east bank. These discussions marked the first concrete steps toward his most enduring legacy, though no final decision came yet. Through these early decrees and routines, Khufu established himself as a ruler who valued order, continuity, and detailed oversight. He did not seek to erase his father's imprint, but to build upon it with greater precision. Officials learned that reports needed to be accurate and complete. Priests understood their obligations would be monitored. Nomarchs realized the king expected prompt obedience. The kingdom continued its familiar rhythm, but now every part of it answered directly to Khufu. The weight of the double crown settled more comfortably with each passing week as he moved from transition into active rule. Vision for eternity. Once the initial decrees had settled into routine and the court had grown accustomed to his steady presence, Khufu turned his attention to the matter that every pharaoh of the Old Kingdom considered central to his legacy: the preparation of his eternal resting place. The decision to build a pyramid did not arise from personal vanity, but from the fundamental duty of the king to preserve the cosmic balance after death. The monument would serve as both tomb and temple, a place where his Ka, the enduring life force, could receive offerings forever, ensuring that Maat remained intact for the living. Khufu had watched his father construct 3 major pyramids over the course of a long reign. Each one had improved on the last in terms of engineering and stability. The bent pyramid at Darsha showed what happened when ambition outpaced knowledge. The red pyramid nearby demonstrated the value of a lower, safer angle. The unfinished structure at Maidum incorporated further refinements. Khufu understood that his own pyramid needed to surpass these in scale and precision, not as a boast, but as a necessary expression of his role. A king who failed to provide adequately for his afterlife risked disrupting the harmony between gods and men. He began by consulting the men who knew the most about such projects: the chief architects, the overseers of works, and the priests who understood the religious requirements. These discussions took place in a quiet chamber off the main audience hall, away from the daily bustle. Models made of mud and small limestone blocks were brought in on trays. Khufu examined them carefully, asking about foundation strength, ramp design, casing material, and the placement of internal chambers. He wanted to know the exact number of blocks required, the estimated time for completion, and the workforce needed at peak seasons. The answers came with calculations based on past projects, adjusted for a larger scale. The religious aspect received equal weight. Priests from Heliopolis, where the cult of Ra held particular influence, explained the symbolic requirements. The pyramid form evoked the primordial mound that rose from the waters of Nun at creation. Its sides aligned with the cardinal directions. Its apex pointed toward the sky, where the king would join the imperishable stars. The structure needed a mortuary temple attached to the east side for daily offerings, and a valley temple connected by a causeway for the arrival of the mummified body. Khufu listened to these explanations and asked for clarification on certain details, such as the orientation of the entrance and the placement of subsidiary pyramids for family members. He also considered the practical side of permanence. The monument had to withstand time, floods, and potential looting. Limestone casing from Tura would give it a smooth, gleaming surface that reflected sunlight across the valley. Granite from Aswan would line the burial chamber and corridors for durability. The internal passages needed to be sealed effectively after interment. Khufu reviewed drawings showing the proposed layout: a descending corridor leading to an underground chamber, then an ascending passage to the main burial room, with relieving chambers above to distribute weight. He approved the basic design, but requested adjustments to make the ascending passage steeper and the burial chamber larger. Resource planning followed naturally. Khufu ordered an inventory of existing quarries and stockpiles. Limestone blocks could come from nearby sites on the west bank, reducing transport distance. Granite required long journeys by river during high water. Copper tools, wooden sledges, ropes of papyrus, and levers of acacia all needed steady supply. He instructed the treasurer to allocate grain and beer rations specifically for the pyramid workforce, separate from regular state provisions. These allocations ensured the project would not drain the kingdom's general reserves. Khufu visited potential sites himself. He travelled by boat to several locations along the west bank, then continued on foot or donkey across the desert plateau. At each spot he walked the ground, felt the bedrock under his sandals, and watched surveyors take measurements with stretched cords and plumb bobs. He noted the view from the east, how clearly the pyramid would be seen from Memphis, and the ease of access to the Nile for unloading stone barges. After several trips, he narrowed the choices to a single elevated plateau that offered solid foundation rock, good visibility, and proximity to existing quarries. This place, later called Giza, stood slightly north of earlier royal cemeteries, giving his monument a prominent position on the horizon. The scale he envisioned required careful calculation. He wanted the base to measure roughly 440 cubits on each side, about 230 meters, and the height to reach 280 cubits, creating a slope of approximately 51 degrees. These proportions followed mathematical ratios that the architects considered harmonious. Khufu approved the dimensions after reviewing scaled models and hearing explanations of how the angle balanced structural integrity with visual impact. The pyramid would contain an estimated 2.3 million blocks, each averaging 2.5 tons, though many were smaller. He also planned for the surrounding complex. The mortuary temple would stand directly against the pyramid's east face, its walls decorated with reliefs showing the king offering to the gods. A long causeway would descend to a valley temple near the river, where purification rituals would take place. Smaller pyramids for queens and a series of mastaba tombs for high officials would surround the main structure, creating a city of the dead that reflected the hierarchy of the living. Khufu specified that space be reserved for these elements from the beginning, so the entire layout remained coherent. Throughout these preparations, Khufu maintained his regular duties. He continued receiving reports from the provinces, overseeing trade expeditions, and participating in temple rituals. The pyramid project did not distract him from day-to-day governance. It became one more responsibility among many. He reviewed progress on the Maidum pyramid as well, deciding to complete its casing in white limestone as originally planned, even as planning for his own monument advanced. The announcement of the new project came gradually, first through private meetings with senior officials, then in broader court gatherings. Khufu explained the purpose plainly. The pyramid would ensure his Ka received perpetual offerings, sustaining the land's fertility and stability. Officials nodded in understanding. They had seen the same reasoning applied to earlier kings. Preparations began quietly. Quarrymen started clearing overburden at selected sites, masons sharpened tools, and scribes drafted initial labour rosters. Khufu's personal involvement remained consistent. He visited the chosen plateau several more times, walking the future baselines staked out with wooden pegs and whitewashed cords. He stood where the entrance would be, imagining the corridors and chambers beneath. These visits were not ceremonial, they were practical inspections to confirm that the site met every requirement. The vision for eternity thus took shape in measured steps. Khufu approached it, as he did every other aspect of rule, with attention to detail, respect for precedent, and a clear sense of duty. The pyramid was not an extravagance, but a necessary act of kingship, one that would outlast his lifetime and remind future generations of the order he had maintained. As planning moved forward, the plateau at Giza began to stir with the first signs of activity, marking the beginning of what would become the most enduring monument of the age. Selecting the Giza site with the basic design parameters established and the necessary resources earmarked, the practical step of choosing the precise location for the pyramid became the immediate focus. Khufu did not delegate this entirely. He understood that the site would determine how effectively the monument fulfilled its purpose: visible from the capital, accessible for stone transport, stable enough to support immense weight, and oriented correctly to the cardinal points and the path of the sun. Survey teams had already been working for months under the direction of the chief architect and the overseer of royal quarries. These men were experienced. Many had worked on Snefru's projects at Dashur and Meidum. They carried tools that had changed little over generations, long measuring cords knotted at regular intervals, wooden sighting rods, plumb bobs made of stone, and shallow trays of water to establish level lines. They also used simple theodolite-like devices fashioned from aligned sticks to check alignments with the rising and setting sun. Khufu reviewed their initial reports in the palace. The papyrus rolls listed several possible plateaus along the west bank of the Nile, all within a reasonable distance of Memphis. Each entry included notes on bedrock quality, distance to the river, elevation above the floodplain, and estimated transport requirements. He studied the accompanying sketches' rough outlines of the terrain with proposed baselines marked in red ink. Some locations were rejected quickly. One sat too low and risked occasional flooding during exceptional inundations. Another lay too far south, making daily oversight from the capital more difficult. A third had visible cracks in the limestone bedrock that could compromise stability. The plateau that drew his attention most lay a short distance north of the existing royal cemeteries at Saqqara. It rose sharply from the edge of the cultivated land, offering a natural prominence that would make the finished pyramid stand out against the western horizon when viewed from Memphis across the river. The ground was solid limestone, weathered but firm, with few visible faults. The elevation provided good drainage and a clear line of sight to the sunrise point. Khufu noted that the site allowed for a long, straight causeway descending eastward to a valley temple near the Nile's edge, where boats could unload granite and other heavy materials during high water. He decided to inspect the plateau in person. The journey took less than a day by boat. Khufu travelled with a small retinue, his chief architect, a priest from Heliopolis to check solar alignments, several surveyors, and a detachment of guards. They disembarked at a temporary landing stage, then proceeded on foot up the gentle slope to the plateau itself. The air carried the dry scent of desert stone and distant river mud. Khufu walked the entire area, stepping carefully over loose rubble and pausing at points where the surveyors had driven wooden stakes to mark potential corners. At the proposed centre point he stood still while the priest used a simple instrument to observe the sun's position. They waited for noon, when the shadow cast by a vertical rod would indicate true north with reasonable accuracy. The alignment matched closely enough to satisfy the religious requirements. Minor adjustments could be made during foundation work. Khufu then paced out the intended base dimensions himself, following the cords the surveyors had stretched. He felt the ground under his sandals hard, unyielding limestone, and satisfied himself that it would bear the weight without settling unevenly. The view impressed him. From the plateau he looked east across the broad green strip of the floodplain, to the glittering Nile and the white walls of Memphis beyond. On a clear day the city's temples and palaces would be plainly visible. When the pyramid rose, its polished casing would catch the morning sun and reflect light back toward the living capital, a daily reminder of the king's enduring presence. The western horizon stretched empty into the desert, giving the monument an uninterrupted backdrop that emphasized its isolation and permanence. Practical considerations weighed heavily. The plateau lay close enough to existing limestone quarries on the west bank that blocks could be dragged overland on sledges without excessive distance. A short canal could be dug from the Nile to bring barges closer during the inundation, reducing the final overland haul. Granite for the inner chambers would still require the long river journey from Aswan, but the site's position allowed unloading at a protected harbour near the Valley Temple. Khufu discussed these logistics with the architect on the spot, pointing out where ramps might rise and where storage yards could be placed without encroaching on the sacred space. He also considered the surrounding area for the full complex. Space existed to the east for the mortuary temple and causeway, to the south and north for smaller pyramids intended for queens, and farther out for mastaba tombs of high officials who would serve in the afterlife court. Khufu walked these prospective zones, mentally placing each element. He wanted the layout to reflect the hierarchy of the living world, his pyramid at the centre, family close by, loyal servants in ordered rows beyond. After the inspection, Khufu returned to the palace and summoned the survey team for a final review. They presented updated maps showing the plateau with the base outline precisely staked. He asked detailed questions about soil tests. They had dug small trial pits to check for cavities or soft layers, and about the proposed orientation. The priest confirmed that the slight deviation from true north could be corrected during construction using stellar observations of the circumpolar stars. Khufu listened, then gave his approval. The site was set. Clearance began almost immediately. Work gangs moved in to remove the thin layer of sand and loose stone covering the bedrock. They used copper chisels and wooden mallets to square off the surface where the foundation would rest. Surveyors rechecked every measurement, driving new stakes and stretching fresh cords. Priests performed a foundation ceremony, pouring milk and scattering grain along the future baselines while reciting formulas to invoke protection from the gods. Khufu did not attend this ritual in person. Other duties kept him in Memphis, but he received a full report and approved the offerings made on his behalf. The selection of the Giza plateau marked a decisive moment. It committed the kingdom to a project that would span decades and draw resources from every nome. Yet Khufu approached it methodically, balancing religious symbolism, engineering practicality, and visual impact. The plateau offered everything required: stability, accessibility, prominence, and alignment with the heavens. Once chosen, it became the fixed point around which the rest of his reign would revolve. Stone began to arrive in greater quantities, ramps took shape, and the first courses of the foundation were laid with careful levelling. The horizon west of Memphis now held the promise of something immense, rising steadily into the sky. Gathering, the workforce. The decision to build at Giza set in motion the largest single labour operation Egypt had ever organised. Khufu understood that the pyramid would require not hundreds, but tens of thousands of men working in coordinated shifts over many years. He therefore issued instructions to the vizier and the overseer of royal works to begin systematic recruitment across the entire kingdom. Messengers travelled up and down the Nile, carrying sealed orders to every nomarch. Each province received a quota based on its population and agricultural output. The call went out during the inundation season, when fields lay under water and farm work paused naturally. In this way, the project drew on the surplus labour of the land without disrupting the annual cycle of planting and harvest. Recruitment happened through established channels. Local officials in each nome compiled lists of able-bodied men between roughly 16 and 60 years old. Preference went to those with some experience in heavy work: stonemasons from Aswan, boatmen from the Delta, farmers accustomed to moving earth for canals. No one was pressed into service against their will. Participation carried prestige and the promise of steady food. Families received assurances that absent husbands and sons would return once the floodwaters receded. In practice, many men volunteered, viewing the work as an act of piety that would benefit their own afterlife as well as the king's. The men arrived at Giza in organised groups. Boats unloaded them at the temporary harbour near the Valley Temple site. They carried their own tools where possible: copper chisels, wooden mallets, ropes of twisted papyrus, and wore simple linen kilts and reed sandals. Upon arrival, each group received a registration. Scribes recorded names, home gnomes, skills, and assigned them to crews. The workforce divided into two main categories: permanent skilled artisans who lived at the site year-round, and seasonal labourers who came for 3 or 4 months at a time. The permanent corps numbered around 5,000. The seasonal influx swelled the total to 20,000 or more during peak inundation months. Organisation followed a military-like structure that Egyptians had used for generations. The men formed files units named after virtues or royal attributes such as the Friends of Khufu or the Strong Ones of Khufu. Each file contained 200 to 250 men and split further into gangs of 40 or 50. Every gang received a colourful name painted on their standards, The drunken crew of Khufu, the enduring ones, or the pure ones. These names fostered pride and friendly competition. Overseers, chosen from experienced men who had worked on Snefru's projects, carried short batons and kept tallies on wooden tablets or ostraca. They reported daily to higher officials who in turn reported to the royal overseer of works. Housing appeared quickly on the plateau's southern edge. The settlement, later known as the Lost City or Hayt el Ghurab, grew into a planned community of mud brick barracks arranged in long rows. Each barrack housed a single gang. Rooms measured about 5 meters by 3, with raised sleeping platforms, small hearths, and storage niches for personal belongings. Roofs of palm thatch kept out the worst of the sun. Separate compounds held the skilled craftsmen, stonecutters, carpenters, surveyors who received slightly larger quarters with courtyards. A bakery district produced thousands of loaves each day. Breweries turned barley into weak beer. Butcher shops processed cattle and fish brought by river. The entire village included granaries, medical facilities staffed by physicians, and small shrines where men could offer quick prayers before their shifts. Rations formed the backbone of daily management. Every worker received a standard daily allotment, recorded meticulously by scribes. The basic ration consisted of 10 loaves of bread, some flat and coarse for the labourers, finer grades for overseers and skilled men, along with 2 jugs of beer, a bundle of onions and garlic, and a portion of dried fish or fresh meat when available. Higher-ranking workers and those performing dangerous tasks such as raising heavy blocks received extra meat, dates, or honey. The bread came from state granaries. The fish arrived by boat from the delta or local Nile catches. Cattle from royal herds supplemented the diet during festivals or after successful deliveries of stone. Officials weighed and measured every distribution to prevent waste or theft. Leftover grain fed the donkeys and oxen that hauled sledges. Work schedules rotated to maintain strength and morale. During the inundation peak, crews laboured in 2 shifts, dawn to midday and midday to dusk, with a rest period in the hottest hours. Each gang worked 10 days straight, then received 1 or 2 days off for rest, family visits if nearby, or participation in local festivals. Medical care remained available around the clock. Broken limbs were splinted with reed and linen, wounds cleaned with honey and bandaged, eye infections treated with copper salts. Physicians kept records of injuries and recoveries, reporting any patterns that might indicate unsafe practices so adjustments could be made. The work itself divided into specialized tasks. One gang quarried limestone on the plateau itself, cutting blocks with copper chisels and wooden wedges soaked in water to split the stone. Another group dragged the blocks on wooden sledges over wet clay or wooden tracks to reduce friction. A third gang positioned the blocks using levers and ropes, checking alignment with plumb lines and levels. Masons smoothed faces and prepared joints. Carpenters built and repaired ramps that grew longer and steeper as the pyramid rose. Surveyors rechecked every course with sighting rods to maintain the precise angle. The rhythm became steady, the sound of mallets on stone, the creak of sledges, the calls of overseers directing movement. Khufu received regular reports on the workforce's condition. He visited the site several times each season, walking among the barracks and watching the men at their tasks. He spoke briefly with overseers, tasted the bread from the bakery, and observed the medical tents. These inspections were practical rather than ceremonial. He wanted to ensure the men remained healthy and motivated because their efficiency directly affected the timeline. On one such visit, he ordered an increase in the fish ration after hearing that the previous month's catch had been lower than expected. On another, he approved the construction of additional shade canopies along the ramps during the hottest months. The surrounding community supported the project in other ways. Families of permanent workers settled in nearby villages, growing vegetables and raising small livestock to supplement rations. Traders arrived regularly with extra goods, pottery, sandals, amulets, setting up temporary markets. Priests from Memphis conducted occasional rituals at the site, blessing the ramps and offering to the gods for safe construction. the workers themselves developed a sense of shared purpose. They carved graffiti on blocks, short prayers, gang names, jokes, showing that even in hard labour they retained human spirit. As months turned into years, the workforce system proved reliable. Quotas from the gnomes arrived on schedule. Skilled men trained apprentices so knowledge passed down. Losses from age or injury were replaced without disrupting progress. The village expanded with new barracks as needed, and storage facilities grew to hold larger stockpiles of tools and materials. Khufu reviewed the annual labour tallies with satisfaction. The kingdom had mobilised its people efficiently and without widespread hardship. Through this organised effort, the pyramid began its steady rise. Each course of stone represented the coordinated labour of thousands of men who had left their fields and workshops to serve the king and, in their own way, the order of the world. The gathering of the workforce had transformed an abstract vision into a living enterprise spread across the plateau, with its own routines, its own community, and its own quiet contribution to the eternal structure that would define Khufu's reign. Expeditions for stone and copper. The steady rise of the pyramid at Giza depended entirely on a continuous supply of materials that Egypt itself could not produce in sufficient quantity or quality within easy reach. Khufu therefore maintained and expanded the network of expeditions his father had established, directing them with the same attention to detail he applied to every other part of rule. These journeys, some short, others spanning months, brought the limestone, granite, copper, and timber needed to keep the builders moving forward without pause. Limestone for the core and the fine outer casing came primarily from two sources. The bulk of the rough blocks originated from the quarries on the Giza plateau itself and nearby outcrops along the west bank. Work gangs cut these directly on site using copper chisels and wooden mallets, splitting the stone along natural bedding planes. For the smoother, whiter casing stones that would eventually give the pyramid its gleaming finish, Khufu relied on the Tura quarries across the Nile, a short distance south of Memphis. Barges loaded at the Tura docks during high water, crossed the river, and unloaded at the Giza harbour. Khufu ordered the quarries worked year-round by permanent crews to build stockpiles ahead of peak construction seasons. He reviewed monthly tallies of blocks cut and delivered, ensuring the pace matched the rate at which masons set them in place. Granite presented a greater challenge. The dark, hard stone required for the burial chamber, the relieving chambers above it, and parts of the entrance passage came from Aswan, more than 800 kilometres upstream. Khufu confirmed the existing quarrying arrangements there. Teams of skilled stonecutters lived semi-permanently near the quarries, using dolerite pounders to shape the massive blocks. During the inundation, when the Nile flowed fastest and deepest, large flat-bottomed barges carried the granite downstream. Each voyage required careful timing to avoid low water stranding the heavy loads. Khufu instructed the overseer of river transport to maintain a rotating schedule of barges so that granite arrived at Giza every few weeks without long gaps. When a particularly large block, some weighing up to 80 tons, needed moving, he approved the use of additional towboats manned by extra crews. Copper tools formed the backbone of the entire operation. Chisels, adzes, saws, and drill bits all required fresh supplies because the soft metal dulled and wore quickly against stone. The main source lay in the Sinai Peninsula, where ancient mines at Wadi Magara and Serabit el-Kadim produced copper ore alongside turquoise. Khufu continued the seasonal expeditions his father had sent. Armed parties of several hundred men, including miners, soldiers, and scribes, travelled across the eastern desert in late winter or early spring when temperatures remained bearable. They followed established routes with known wells, setting up temporary camps near the mine entrances. Miners extracted the ore, smelted it on site into ingots, and loaded the metal onto donkeys for the return journey. Turquoise and malachite came as secondary products, valued for jewellery and pigments used in the pyramid's decoration and in temple offerings. Khufu received detailed reports from these expeditions upon their return. The expedition leader presented himself in the palace audience hall, accompanied by sample ingots and stones. The king examined the copper for purity, good quality, showed a clean reddish colour with few impurities, then listened to accounts of the journey, water sources found reliable, any encounters with local Bedouin tribes, the total weight of metal brought back. He asked specific questions about losses, injuries, and the condition of the donkeys. If the yield fell short of expectations, he ordered adjustments for the next season, perhaps sending more men or additional pack animals. Successful expeditions earned the leader a small reward, a title, a linen garment, or a plot of land near Memphis. Timber represented another critical import. Egypt had few large native trees suitable for heavy beams or sledges. Cedar from the forests of Byblos on the Levantine coast provided the strongest and most durable wood. Khufu maintained the long-standing trade relationship with the rulers of Byblos. Egyptian ships, long, narrow vessels with high prows and stern posts, sailed from the delta ports carrying linen, papyrus, grain, and gold. They returned loaded with cedar logs, some more than 20 meters long. Khufu reviewed the arrival manifests each time a fleet docked, checking the number and size of logs against the needs of the carpenters at Giza. The wood went into ramp construction, lever poles, sledge runners, and the inner framework of boats used on the Nile. Smaller native acacia and sycamore supplemented it for everyday tools. The expeditions required steady coordination. Khufu appointed trusted officials to oversee each major route, one for the Sinai copper mines, another for Aswan granite, a third for the Byblos cedar trade. These men reported directly to him every month, even when no expedition was currently in progress. They maintained lists of available ships, pack animals, and trained crews. Khufu insisted on advanced planning. Expeditions scheduled so that materials arrived in sequence granite for the inner chambers before the core masonry covered them, cedar for ramps before the next course rose too high. Hazards were part of every journey. Desert expeditions faced sandstorms, scarce water, and occasional raids by nomadic groups. River voyages risked shifting sandbars or sudden winds. Khufu addressed these risks practically. He ordered extra water jars carried on donkey trains, armed escorts for valuable loads, and regular maintenance of boats. When a granite barge grounded during one low-water season, he approved the unloading and overland dragging of the blocks until deeper water returned. Such incidents were recorded as lessons for future planning. The influx of materials created visible activity along the Nile. At Giza, unloading areas bustled with gangs moving granite blocks from barges to sledges. In Memphis, cedar logs stacked in royal yards drew carpenters who shaped them into beams. Copper ingots arrived at the palace treasury, then distributed to toolmakers who recast them into fresh chisels. Khufu occasionally walked these areas himself, observing the flow of goods and speaking briefly with overseers about bottlenecks. Through these expeditions, Khufu kept the pyramid project supplied without straining the kingdom's core economy. Grain and labour quotas remained steady. The expeditions drew on specialised groups rather than general conscription. The journeys also reinforced Egypt's rich copper from the east, granite from the south, cedar from across the sea, showing neighbouring regions that the new king could maintain the same level of organisation and authority his father had demonstrated. As the years passed, the steady arrival of stone and metal became as predictable as the Nile flood itself. Khufu reviewed the supply chain with the same calm regularity he applied to court audiences. Each successful delivery moved the pyramid one step closer to completion, layer by measured layer, while the kingdom continued its familiar rhythm undisturbed. Family and Hirs Khufu's family life unfolded within the same ordered framework that governed the rest of his days. The royal household remained large and complex, with multiple wives, numerous children, and a network of relatives who lived in or near the palace compound. He approached family matters with the same deliberate care he gave to administration and construction, maintaining balance, ensuring loyalty, and preparing the next generation without haste or favoritism. His principal wives occupied separate but well-appointed quarters within the palace. The most prominent among them held titles such as king's wife, or mother of the king's children, designations that carried real influence in court circles. These women managed their own small staffs of attendants, stewards, and musicians. Khufu visited their apartments regularly, often in the late afternoon or evening when official duties eased. Meals shared with one or more wives happened in private dining rooms furnished with low tables and cushions. The food mirrored palace standards: roasted fowl, stewed vegetables, bread, fruit, and beer served by discreet servants who withdrew once everything was arranged. Children from these unions numbered in the double digits by the middle years of his reign. Sons and daughters grew up in the palace under the watchful eyes of nurses, tutors, and older siblings. Boys received training similar to what Khufu himself had experienced: hieroglyphs, basic mathematics, ritual procedures, and physical exercises with bows and staffs. Girls learned household management, music, and the religious duties expected of royal women. Khufu made time to observe their progress, sometimes summoning a tutor to report on a particular child's aptitude or behaviour. He did not indulge in open affection in public settings, but in private he listened to their questions and corrected their posture or pronunciation when needed. He groomed his heirs methodically. Several sons showed early promise in different areas. One excelled at reading and writing. Another demonstrated steady judgment in practical tasks. A third handled physical training with natural ease. Khufu assigned them small responsibilities as they matured. One son accompanied him on inspections of the granaries. Another observed meetings with nomarchs. A third joined short trips to Giza to watch the pyramid rise. These assignments tested character and ability while exposing the boys to the realities of rule. Khufu watched closely for signs of reliability, temperament, and understanding of Mart. He avoided declaring a single heir prematurely. Succession remained fluid until circumstances made the choice clear. Daughters played important roles as well. Some married high officials or nomarchs to strengthen alliances within the kingdom. These marriages were arranged with care, often after the daughter reached an appropriate age, and the match had been discussed with the family involved. Khufu met personally with prospective sons-in-law, asking about their service record and family background. A successful union brought the husband closer to the throne, sometimes with added titles or estates. Daughters who remained unmarried or widowed continued to live in the palace, participating in religious ceremonies and court events. Their presence reinforced the royal lineage's continuity. The Queen Mother Hetepheres remained a steady influence. Though advanced in years, she retained her own apartments and a small court. Khufu consulted her on family matters and palace protocol. She offered advice quietly, reminders about certain officials' loyalties, observations about a grandchild's development drawn from decades of experience at the centre of power. He listened attentively, valuing her perspective even when he chose a different path. Her health declined gradually. When she passed, Khufu arranged a burial near his father's monument, with appropriate offerings and a small mastaba tomb that reflected her status. Extended family members, half-brothers, cousins, uncles from lesser branches lived in the palace or in nearby estates granted by the king. They held positions in the administration or priesthood, contributing to the smooth functioning of the court. Khufu kept these relationships balanced, rewarding competence, correcting overreach, preventing factionalism. Family gatherings occurred during major festivals or private meals. These occasions mixed formal protocol with moments of ease. Music played softly, children ran in the gardens under supervision, adults spoke of the day's events. Daily interactions with children followed a predictable pattern. Khufu saw them most often in the evening. After the main meal, he sometimes walked in the palace gardens with one or two sons or daughters, asking about their lessons or games. He corrected errors, gently improper grip on a bow, incorrect recitation of a formula, and praised effort when warranted. These walks allowed brief personal contact amid the demands of rule. He taught them practical lessons: the importance of accurate records, the need to listen before speaking, the value of steady work. Religious observances bound the family together. During festivals, the royal children participated in processions, carrying small standards or offerings. Khufu led the family group in presenting gifts at temple altars. These shared duties reinforced their collective role as upholders of divine order. At home, small chapels in the private quarters received daily attention. Children learned to light incense and place bread before household gods under their father's eye. As the years advanced, Khufu began to focus more deliberately on succession. He observed which sons showed the qualities needed for rule, calm judgment, attention to detail, respect for tradition. One son in particular, later known as Khafre, demonstrated a steady temperament and an interest in the pyramid project. Another, Jedefre, showed aptitude for administration. Khufu assigned them increasing responsibilities, overseeing minor construction tasks, attending audiences, reviewing reports. He did not announce a preference openly. The court understood that the choice would become evident in time. The family household adapted to the pyramid's demands. Some children visited Giza occasionally, watching the work from a safe distance. They saw the ramps, the sledges, the gangs moving stone. These trips gave them a tangible sense of their father's greatest undertaking. Back in Memphis, daily life continued its rhythm lessons in the morning, meals together, quiet evenings with music or stories. Khufu ensured the children understood that privilege carried duty. The palace was not merely a place of comfort, but the centre from which the two lands were governed. Through all these years, the family remained a quiet anchor for Khufu. Wives provided companionship and counsel. Children offered continuity and hope for the future. Relatives strengthened the web of loyalty that supported the throne. He managed these relationships with the same measured approach he brought to every other aspect of rule: fair, attentive, forward-looking. The heirs he raised would one day inherit not just the crown, but the unfinished monument on the plateau and the kingdom it was meant to protect. Temples and divine duties. Khufu's attention to the temples and the gods formed a constant thread through every year of his reign, as essential to maintaining the kingdom as the supply of stone or the flow of grain. He viewed these duties not as separate from his other responsibilities, but as the foundation that made everything else possible. The gods, particularly Ra and Ptah, required regular attention so that the Nile continued its cycle, the fields remained fertile, and the people stayed content under his rule. He approached this work with the same steady habits he brought to the palace routines and the pyramid project. Each morning after the private offering in his palace chapel, Khufu received reports from the priests of the major sanctuaries. Messengers arrived early with small papyrus rolls listing the previous day's activities, how much bread and beer had been placed on the altars, which statues had been washed and dressed in fresh linen, and any requests for additional supplies. He read these summaries while finishing his breakfast, noting any irregularities or shortages. If a temple reported low grain stocks, he instructed the treasurer to release an extra measure from the royal stores. These daily exchanges kept him connected to the religious life of the kingdom without requiring his constant physical presence. He visited the main temples in Memphis regularly. The great sanctuary of Ptah stood within the city walls, its massive pylons and columned halls visible from the palace rooftops. Khufu walked there several times each month, accompanied by a small group of officials and priests. The route took him along shaded streets where ordinary people paused their work to bow as he passed. Inside the temple complex, the air grew cooler and heavier with incense. He moved through the outer courtyards where public offerings took place, then into the inner areas reserved for the king and high priests. There he presented fresh offerings himself, placing bread on the altar, pouring beer from a small jar, lighting incense so the smoke rose toward the ceiling beams carved with stars. The priest chanted the fixed formulas while he stood in silence, his hands raised in the traditional gesture of giving. The Temple of Ra at Heliopolis received special attention. Located a short boat journey north of Memphis, it served as the center for solar worship and held particular importance for the royal family. Khufu traveled there by barge when the river level allowed easy passage. The journey itself became part of the ritual. He stood at the prow watching the temples and fields slip by. Upon arrival, he followed the processional way lined with sphinxes, entered the main sanctuary, and participated in the midday rites. He examined the temple's records of solar observations, asking the priests about any deviations in the timing of festivals or the height of the Nile. These visits reinforced his role as the son of Ra, the living link between heaven and earth. Festivals marked the high points of the religious calendar. The annual Opet festival in Thebes required careful preparation, even though Khufu rarely travelled that far south himself. He sent representatives carrying royal offerings and reviewed the plans for processions and banquets. Closer to home, the Feast of the Inundation brought celebrations throughout Memphis. Khufu presided over the main ceremony at the riverbank, watching priests cast offerings into the rising waters while musicians played and crowds gathered along the banks. He stood under a canopy wearing the double crown and a ceremonial kilt, raising his hands to bless the flood. The people responded with cheers and scattered flowers, seeing in him the guarantor of the coming harvest. He ensured that every major temple received its due share of resources. Estates attached to the sanctuaries produced grain, cattle, and linen specifically for divine offerings. Khufu reviewed the annual accounts of these estates with the same care he gave to state granaries. If a temple's lands had suffered poor flooding, he ordered repairs to canals or reassigned labour to restore productivity. Priests submitted yearly inventories listing every item used in rituals down to the number of lotus flowers placed before the statues. He approved these lists and occasionally increased allocations for important festivals, believing that generosity toward the gods returned prosperity to the land. Smaller local shrines also fell under his oversight. In the nomes, provincial temples dedicated to regional deities received regular supplies of copper tools, incense, and fine cloth. Nomarchs reported on the condition of these shrines during their audiences in Memphis. Khufu listened and issued instructions. Rebuild a collapsed wall here, replace worn statues there, increase the number of daily offerings at another. These commands travelled back with the returning officials, ensuring that even distant communities felt the king's attention to divine matters. The priests themselves formed an important part of his circle. High priests of Ptah and Ra held positions of trust and often advised him on matters beyond religion. Khufu met with them privately after major rituals, discussing not only temple affairs but also the mood of the people and any signs of discontent. These conversations remained confidential. The priests understood their role as both servants of the gods and observers of the kingdom. In return, they received estates, titles, and the honour of having their names recorded near royal monuments. Khufu participated personally in key ceremonies throughout the year. During the said festival preparations, though he had not yet reached the traditional 30-year mark, he began studying the rites that would renew his power. He practiced the ritual run and the symbolic acts with senior priests in a private courtyard. These rehearsals kept the traditions alive and prepared him for future celebrations. At harvest festivals, he received the first sheaf of grain from the fields, offering it at the temple before distributing portions to officials and workers. His family joined him in many of these duties. Wives and older children walked in processions, carrying small standards or helping present offerings. The royal sons learned the gestures and formulas by observing their father. These shared experiences taught them that kingship involved service to the gods as much as command over men. Khufu watched their participation carefully, noting who showed proper respect and attention. The pyramid project itself incorporated religious elements from the start. As the structure rose at Giza, small shrines appeared along the construction paths where workers could offer quick prayers. Khufu approved the placement of a temple dedicated to Hathor near the Valley Temple site, ensuring the goddess of the West received her share. He visited these areas during inspections, making offerings on the growing monument to bless the work. Daily life in the temples continued its ancient rhythm under his watch. Priests rose before dawn to wash the statues, dress them in fresh garments, and present the first meal of the day. Khufu's decrees ensured they had everything needed: oil for lamps, myrrh for incense, fine linen for the gods' clothing. In return, he expected detailed reports and absolute loyalty. Any priest found misusing temple resources faced swift removal and replacement. Through these visits, festivals, and provisions, Khufu kept the divine order in balance. He believed that neglecting the gods would invite chaos, failed floods, poor harvests, unrest among the people. By giving consistently and personally, he maintained the favour that allowed the pyramid to rise and the kingdom to prosper. The temples of Memphis and beyond became extensions of his palace, places where his rule connected directly with the forces that sustained Egypt year after year. As the seasons turned and the pyramid grew taller, these religious duties remained unchanged. Khufu continued his regular rounds, his offerings, and his oversight with the same calm consistency. The gods received their due, the land stayed fertile, and the people saw in their king the living embodiment of Ma'at. This quiet, steady service to the divine formed the unseen foundation beneath every other achievement of his reign. Mid-reign challenges. The pyramid at Giza reached roughly half its final height, and the workforce settled into a reliable, annual rhythm. Reports from the provinces began arriving with greater frequency and urgency. Khufu had reached the middle stretch of his reign, a period when the demands of the great monument tested the kingdom's capacity to balance its resources. The daily audiences in Memphis now carried a heavier load of practical concerns from distant nomes, and he addressed each one without altering the steady pace he had established. The first signs of strain came through the regular dispatches carried by nomarchs or their couriers. In the southern nomes near Aswan, one report described a lower-than-average inundation the previous year. The flood had receded earlier than usual, leaving some fields drier than expected and reducing the grain yield by nearly a fifth in certain districts. The nomarch requested a temporary reduction in the labour quota for Giza, so that more men could stay home to repair irrigation channels and plant additional crops in the remaining moist soil. Khufu reviewed the figures himself, comparing them against the central granary records that showed overall reserves still sufficient for another full season. He approved a modest cut in that nome's contribution for the next inundation period, but required the nomarch to submit monthly updates on canal work and expected harvest. Similar messages arrived from the Delta region in the north. Heavy rains in the Mediterranean catchment had caused the Nile branches to rise too quickly in one area, flooding low-lying villages and damaging storehouses. Local officials listed ruined grain sacks and displaced families. Khufu instructed the treasurer to release emergency supplies from Memphis stockpiles, enough barley and dried fish to feed the affected communities for 3 months. At the same time, he ordered a survey team to travel north and assess whether permanent dikes needed strengthening. These adjustments drew directly from the pyramid's allocated grain, yet he kept the reduction small enough that work on the plateau never slowed. Farther east, trouble surfaced in the Sinai mining expeditions. One caravan returned with fewer copper ingots than planned, after a sudden sandstorm scattered the pack animals and damaged several smelting furnaces. The expedition leader described lost tools and 2 men injured by falling rock. Khufu listened to the full account in a private session, then directed the overseer of mines to send replacement equipment on the next regular journey and to increase the escort size for future trips. He also approved extra rations of meat and beer for the miners as compensation for the hardship. The temporary shortfall in copper meant that masons at Giza had to reuse older chisels longer than usual, but the carpenters compensated by sharpening them more frequently and fashioning additional wooden levers from local acacia. In the western oases, a different kind of challenge appeared. Nomads from the desert fringes had begun raiding small caravan routes that supplied natron and other minerals used in temple rituals and mummification preparations. The local governor reported stolen donkeys and damaged wells. Khufu responded by sending a small detachment of troops, experienced men who had served on earlier expeditions, along with instructions to restore the wells and establish regular patrols. He made it clear that the troops should return once order was restored rather than remain permanently, preserving manpower for the plateau. These reports reached him in sequence during the morning audiences. Khufu never reacted with visible frustration. He sat on the dais, examined the papyrus rolls, asked for clarification on numbers, and issued decisions that distributed the burden fairly across the kingdom. He instructed the vizier to maintain a separate ledger, tracking all diversions from pyramid resources so that the accounts remained transparent. This ledger showed that less than 10% of the annual grain allocation had been redirected in any given year, a figure he considered acceptable as long as the pyramid continued its steady upward growth. The balancing act extended to labour as well. When a nome in Middle Egypt reported an outbreak of cattle disease that reduced ploughing capacity, Khufu temporarily lowered its quota of seasonal workers by 200 men. In exchange, he required the nomarch to provide extra donkeys for hauling stone at Giza the following season. This swap kept the overall workforce numbers stable while helping the affected province recover its herds. Similar exchanges occurred with other districts facing localized problems, flood damage, locust swarms, or depleted fisheries. Each time Khufu ensured the pyramid project received equivalent value elsewhere so that construction timelines stayed on schedule. He also monitored the impact on the royal household and court. Wives and older sons heard summaries of these reports during evening meals. One son accompanied him on a short inspection trip to a nearby nome, where canal repairs were underway. The journey allowed the boy to see firsthand how provincial needs intersected with the larger demands of the monument. Khufu used these occasions to explain the calculations aloud. How much grain could safely be moved? How many men could be spared without halting ramps or quarrying? The lessons remained practical rather than formal. Priests from the temples brought their own concerns. One sanctuary in the south reported that its attached estates had suffered from the same low flood, reducing offerings to the local god. Khufu increased its share of central grain for 3 months, while directing the nomarch to accelerate canal clearing in that district. He reminded the priest that the pyramid itself served as a perpetual offering to the gods, linking the monument directly to divine favour. Throughout these mid-reign years, the pyramid continued rising. Each new course of stone required the same careful coordination, yet the workforce never lacked for bread or tools. Khufu reviewed the monthly progress reports with satisfaction, noting that the structure had now passed the level where the ascending passage branched toward the burial chamber. The challenges from the provinces had tested the kingdom's resilience but had not disrupted the essential flow of materials or labour. He kept the adjustments small and temporary, always calculating the long-term needs of both the living and the eternal monument. The people in the nomes felt the king's hand through these decisions. When a district received extra grain or a reduced labour call, word spread along the river that Khufu had listened and responded fairly. No widespread unrest developed. The nomarchs understood that loyalty and accurate reporting earned prompt help, while neglect invited quiet correction. Khufu reinforced this understanding by occasionally promoting a competent official from a province that had managed its difficulties well, bringing him into the Memphis administration. As the inundation season approached again, Khufu reviewed the accumulated reports one final time before the new quotas went out. He adjusted the overall labour distribution slightly, drawing a few more men from stable northern nomes to offset the southern shortfalls. The pyramid would receive its full complement for the coming months, and the provinces would receive the support they needed to recover. This careful equilibrium defined the middle years of his rule. Neither the monument nor the land suffered lasting harm. The distant troubles had served as a reminder that even a prosperous kingdom required constant attention. Khufu met each challenge with the same measured approach he applied to every other duty, ensuring that resources flowed where they were most needed at any given moment. The pyramid continued its ascent on the plateau, while the two lands remained fed, irrigated, and orderly under his oversight. Construction milestones. The pyramid at Giza passed its midpoint during the later years of Khufu's reign, and the structure began to reveal its final form against the western sky. Each new layer of limestone blocks added height and definition, turning the stepped core into the smooth-sided monument that would dominate the plateau for millennia. The engineers who had trained under Snefru's projects applied their accumulated knowledge to solve the practical problems that arose at greater elevations, while the workforce maintained its steady pace without major interruption. By this stage, the base courses were complete, and the sides had reached roughly 100 metres above the plateau. The outer casing stones from Chura now covered the lower third of each face, giving the structure a polished white appearance that caught the morning sun and reflected it across the Nile Valley. Masons worked from the top down on these casing blocks, fitting them with joints so tight that a knife blade could not slide between them. They used copper chisels to trim the edges on the ground before the blocks were raised, then levered each one into position with wooden beams and adjusted the final alignment with thin layers of mortar mixed from gypsum and sand. The internal passages had already been sealed at the lower levels. The descending corridor leading to the unfinished underground chamber had been blocked with granite plugs slid into place from above. Higher up, the ascending passage to the grand gallery was complete, its walls dressed smooth, and its ceiling formed from massive limestone beams set at a precise angle. Engineers had installed a series of relieving chambers above the future burial room to distribute the immense weight of the stone above. These chambers were roofed with granite slabs laid in cantilever fashion so that the pressure transferred outward rather than downward onto the sarcophagus area. Khufu received models of these chambers during his palace reviews and approved the final placement after the architects demonstrated how the load would be carried safely. Ramps remained the primary method for lifting the heavier blocks. As the height increased, the main ramp on the south side had grown longer and wider, constructed in layers of rubble and mud brick, with a gentle slope that never exceeded 1 in 10. As the pyramid rose, the ramp was extended, and its surface resurfaced with fresh clay to keep the sledges moving smoothly. Workers poured water ahead of each sledge to reduce friction, allowing teams of 40 men to pull blocks weighing several tons up the incline in coordinated steps. Side ramps branched off at intervals so that casing stones could be delivered directly to the faces without interfering with core construction. Surveyors checked the ramp alignments daily with plumb lines and water levels to prevent any twist that might throw the entire structure out of square. The workforce adapted its routines to the changing height. Gangs assigned to the upper levels received additional training in rope handling and scaffolding. They built temporary wooden platforms around the working face, secured with ropes of twisted papyrus so that masons could dress the stones in place. The sound of mallets striking chisels echoed across the plateau. From dawn until the midday heat forced a rest period. In the cooler evening hours, the men lowered themselves down the ramps on ropes or walked the long paths back to the barracks village, where fresh bread and beer waited in the communal halls. Khufu visited the site more frequently during these years, travelling by boat and then by donkey along the prepared road from the river. He walked the base perimeter, measuring the remaining height with his own eyes and noting how the shadow of the structure lengthened across the desert at sunset. During one inspection, he observed a team fitting a casing block on the northeast corner and asked the overseer to explain the method for maintaining the exact slope angle. The architect used a simple wooden frame with a plumb bob to demonstrate the check. Khufu nodded and requested that similar frames be made for every corner so that the 4 sides remained perfectly symmetrical. These visits were practical. He tasted the workers' bread, examined worn tools, and approved the addition of extra shade shelters along the upper ramps where the sun struck hardest. Engineering solutions continued to emerge as new challenges appeared. When the grand gallery reached its full length, the builders installed a series of slots in the walls to hold wooden beams that would later support the ceiling blocks after burial. The gallery itself featured a corbelled roof that narrowed toward the top, distributing weight evenly. Higher still, the burial chamber was nearing completion, its granite walls and ceiling beams set with such precision that the room felt almost weightless inside. Engineers had calculated the exact position so that a shaft aligned with the North Star would allow the king's spirit to ascend. Khufu examined a small model of this alignment in the palace and confirmed the orientation matched the observations taken by the priests at Heliopolis. The surrounding complex also advanced in stages. The mortuary temple against the east face had its foundation courses laid and its first columns erected. Workers carved reliefs on the limestone walls showing Khufu presenting offerings to the gods, though the final painting and polishing waited until the entire structure stood complete. The long causeway descending to the valley temple progressed steadily. Its walls rose on either side of the processional road, protecting the route from sand and providing shade for future ceremonies. At the river end, the Valley Temple received its granite facing, creating a solid landing place where the royal barge would one day moor. By the later seasons, the pyramid's shape had become unmistakable even from the eastern bank of the Nile. Travellers on the river looked west and saw the gleaming white form rising above the plateau, its apex already sharp against the sky, though still many courses short of completion. The reflection on calm mornings turned the structure into a mirror of sunlight, visible from Memphis rooftops and reminding everyone in the capital of the king's enduring work. Farmers in the fields paused occasionally to point it out to their children, describing how the monument would stand long after their own lives ended. The workforce reached new levels of efficiency during this phase. Skilled masons trained younger men in the exact techniques for dressing, casing stones, passing down the knowledge through direct demonstration rather than written instructions. Quarry gangs on the plateau itself cut blocks to standard sizes, reducing the amount of trimming needed at the building site. The copper supply from Sinai arrived in steady shipments, allowing toolmakers to keep every chisel sharp and every saw blade ready. Records kept by the scribes showed that the number of blocks set per month remained consistent even as the height increased, a testament to the organization established years earlier. Khufu continued to receive monthly tallies of progress in the palace. The reports listed the exact course number reached, the number of casing stones placed that season, and any minor adjustments made to the ramp system. He reviewed these figures alongside the provincial accounts, ensuring that the resources diverted to construction did not create shortages elsewhere. The steady advancement reassured him that the monument would stand as intended, its proportions exact and its purpose clear. As the structure climbed higher, the daily life around it settled into a familiar rhythm for those involved. Workers rose before dawn, ate their rations in the barracks, and climbed the ramps with the rising sun. Overseers moved among the gangs with their wooden tally sticks, marking each block set in place. In the evenings they returned to the village where bakers fired fresh bread and brewers filled jars from the day's fermentation. Small shrines along the paths received quick offerings of breadcrumbs or drops of beer from men who had completed their shift safely. The plateau itself changed appearance, with each season ramps lengthening in winter, casing stones gleaming brighter. After summer rains washed the dust away, the milestones accumulated quietly. The first course of the burial chamber roofed, the grand gallery sealed at its lower end. The first Queen's Pyramid beside the main structure brought to its full height. Each achievement marked another step toward the day when the final capstone would be lowered into place and the ramps dismantled. The pyramid no longer looked like a collection of separate blocks, but like a single unified form rising from the desert floor, its sides straight and its proportions balanced according to the sacred ratios the architects had followed from the beginning. Khufu observed these changes with quiet satisfaction during his visits. The monument was becoming what he had envisioned years earlier, a lasting expression of order that would protect his car and sustain the land long after his voice fell silent. The engineers continued solving each new problem as it arose, the workforce continued its measured labour, and the shape on the horizon grew clearer with every passing season, layer by steady layer. Later years of Rulek Khufu entered the later decades of his reign with the same measured pace that had defined every previous year, though the accumulation of seasons now showed in the slight stiffness of his joints and the grey that had begun to appear at the edges of his shaved scalp. He remained active, rising before dawn for the temple offering and moving through the palace corridors without assistance, but he adjusted certain routines to preserve his strength for the tasks that still required his direct attention. The pyramid at Giza had reached its upper courses, and the kingdom around it felt more settled than at any earlier point, its administration running with the efficiency he had carefully built. Each season he made the journey to the plateau, usually during the cooler months when the desert wind carried less dust. The trip by boat and donkey took the same route it always had, yet now he spent longer periods simply observing from a shaded pavilion erected near the base. He sat on a low folding stool, wearing his plain linen kilt and a light cloak against the morning chill, while the chief architect pointed out the latest course completed and the adjustments made to the ramp system. Khufu listened without hurry, asking about the exact number of blocks set since the last visit and the condition of the copper tools still arriving from Sinai. He approved small modifications, widening a section of the upper ramp to allow 2 sledges to pass, increasing the water supply points for the men working at greater heights, then watched the gangs move along the scaffolding with the steady rhythm he had come to recognize. Back in Memphis, the daily audiences continued, though he now limited them to the most essential reports. The vizier arrived each morning with a thinner stack of papyrus, summarizing provincial grain yields, canal maintenance, and any lingering effects from earlier low floods. Khufu reviewed the figures against the central records, noting that the kingdom's reserves had grown rather than diminished despite the pyramid's demands. He issued fewer new decrees, preferring to let the system he had established run its course while he focused on the final stages of the monument. When a nomarch requested guidance on a local dispute over field boundaries, Khufu listened to both sides through the vizier, then dictated a simple resolution based on the original land surveys kept in the archive. His reflection on the kingdom's condition came during quiet evenings in the palace garden. After the evening meal, he walked the colonnaded paths alone or with one trusted advisor, the oil lamps casting long shadows across the lotus pools. He considered how the nomes had stabilized. Southern districts that once reported shortages now sent consistent surpluses northward. Northern delta provinces maintained their fisheries and trade without repeated emergencies. Trade ships from Byblos arrived on schedule with cedar. The Sinai expeditions returned with reliable copper, and the Aswan granite barges delivered the final pieces needed for the pyramid's inner chambers. The people in the streets of Memphis appeared well fed, their markets stocked with bread, onions and fish as they had been throughout his reign. He saw this as the direct result of the order he had maintained. Accurate records, fair labour quotas, consistent attention to the temples. Family matters occupied more of his private hours. His sons had matured into capable men, each carrying responsibilities that tested their readiness. One oversaw the final fitting of casing stones at Giza, reporting directly to his father with detailed measurements and sketches. Another managed the distribution of rations to the worker village, ensuring no shortages occurred even during peak seasons. Khufu spoke with them individually after the main audiences, asking specific questions about the men under their command and the problems they had solved. He offered quiet corrections when needed and quiet approval when reports showed steady judgment. The daughters who remained in the palace assisted in temple ceremonies, their presence adding continuity to the royal rituals. Wives continued their separate households, consulted on family arrangements and occasionally on matters of palace protocol. The household felt settled, its members aligned with the larger duties of the throne. Health concerns appeared gradually. Palace physicians visited twice each month, checking his pulse, examining his eyes, and recommending adjustments to his diet, more soft bread and boiled vegetables, less roasted meat on warmer days. Khufu followed their advice without complaint, understanding that his body needed to last until the pyramid reached completion. He reduced the length of his walks in the desert heat, but maintained his presence at major festivals, standing under the canopy with the double crown in place while priests performed the offerings. The people still saw him as the living guarantor of Ma'at, and he intended to fulfill that role visibly as long as strength remained. The pyramid itself provided the clearest measure of his later years. From the palace roof at certain times of day he could see its gleaming upper portion across the river, the white Tura casing reflecting sunlight even when the lower slopes lay in shadow. Monthly reports from the site listed the exact height reached and the number of courses remaining. Khufu calculated the remaining seasons needed, factoring in the steady labour supply and the predictable arrival of materials. He approved the construction of the final Queen's pyramids beside the main structure, each one smaller but built with the same precision. The mortuary temple advanced with its columns and reliefs, the causeway neared completion, and the valley temple received its final granite facing. These elements formed the complete complex he had envisioned from the beginning, now taking tangible shape under his oversight. Provincial stability allowed him to redirect small resources back to the people. When granaries reported surpluses after a particularly good inundation, he authorized the release of extra grain for local festivals in several nomes. Nomarchs received instructions to distribute it through village headmen rather than temple stores, ensuring ordinary families benefited directly. These gestures were modest but deliberate, reinforcing the bond between the throne and the land that supported the pyramid. Reports returned showing increased participation in harvest celebrations and fewer complaints about labour quotas. Khufu also began preparing the administrative records for the future. He ordered the vizier to compile a summary ledger of all major decisions, labour allocations, temple endowments, trade agreements stored in duplicate in the palace archive, and a secure chamber near the pyramid. These documents would guide his successor without requiring sudden changes. He reviewed portions of the ledger himself, confirming that every entry reflected the principles of fairness and order he had followed. The process took several months but gave him satisfaction, knowing the kingdom's machinery would continue functioning smoothly. Evenings brought moments of quiet reflection. After the final report of the day, Khufu sat in his private chamber with a single lamp, reviewing the small models of the finished pyramid brought periodically from Giza. He turned the miniature in his hands, noting how the proportions matched the sacred ratios and how the alignment with the northern stars remained exact. These models reminded him of the long sequence of choices that had led to this point. The site selection, the workforce organization, the steady supply lines, the adjustments during difficult seasons. The kingdom felt stronger than when he had taken the throne, its borders secure, its temples supplied, its people fed and occupied in productive work. He continued the daily temple visits when possible, walking the short distance to Ptah's sanctuary or travelling by boat to Heliopolis. The priests noted his consistent presence and the unchanged generosity in offerings. Khufu believed these acts sustained the divine favour that had allowed the pyramid to rise without major calamity. During one such visit, he stood before the statue of Ra as the midday light streamed through the sanctuary opening, the priests chanting the familiar formulas around him. The moment felt like a continuation of every similar rite he had performed since his father's time. The later years passed in this steady pattern. Seasonal inspections at Giza, morning audiences shortened but focused, family discussions in the evenings, and the quiet satisfaction of seeing the kingdom hold together. Age brought no dramatic decline, only a natural slowing that he managed with the same discipline he had always shown. The pyramid on the plateau served as both achievement and reminder, its shape now nearly complete, its purpose clear, its endurance assured. Khufu reviewed its progress each season, with the knowledge that the land he had governed remained prosperous and ordered, ready for whatever came after his own time ended. Preparing. Succession Khufu reached the point in his reign where thoughts turned naturally toward what would follow his own time on earth. The pyramid stood nearly complete, its final courses visible from the palace roof on clear days, and the kingdom had settled into a prosperity that felt durable. He began the careful work of ensuring a smooth transition, drawing on the same methodical approach he had used for every major undertaking, selecting carefully, testing gradually, and documenting everything so that the handover would preserve rather than disrupt the order he had maintained. He had narrowed his focus to one son above the others. This son, Khafre, had shown consistent qualities over many years: steady judgment in the face of practical problems, attention to detail in reports from Giza, and a quiet respect for the religious duties that underpinned the throne. Khufu had watched him closely during the later construction phases. Khafre oversaw the placement of the last casing stones on the lower faces, checked the alignment of the mortuary temple columns, and managed the final deliveries of granite for the inner chambers. His reports arrived promptly, written in clear hieroglyphs with precise measurements and no unnecessary flourish. Khufu summoned him often for private discussions, asking pointed questions about workforce morale, material stockpiles, and any signs of strain in the supply lines. The answers came without hesitation and backed by evidence from the scribes' records. To test readiness further, Khufu assigned Khafre broader responsibilities within the palace. He directed his son to sit beside him during morning audiences for an entire inundation season, listening to nomarchs report on grain yields and canal conditions. Khafre observed without speaking at first, then when invited, offered measured comments that aligned closely with what Khufu himself would have said. The vizier and other officials noted the similarity in approach: calm, fact-based, unwilling to accept vague assurances. Khufu approved small independent tasks as well, reviewing the annual temple inventories from Heliopolis, approving minor adjustments to labour quotas in 2 stable gnomes, and inspecting the cedar stockpiles in the royal yards. Each assignment returned with detailed accounts and sensible recommendations. Khufu read them in the evening lamplight, satisfied that the young man understood the balance required to keep the kingdom functioning. He did not neglect the other sons. One, who had shown skill in administration, continued to manage the distribution of rations to the worker village at Giza. Another, more inclined toward religious matters, assisted the high priests in coordinating festival preparations. These roles kept them occupied and useful, preventing any sense of exclusion while allowing Khufu to observe their continued development. Daughters who remained unmarried received additional duties in the palace household, overseeing the preparation of royal linen, managing the storerooms for festival garments, tasks that reinforced their place in the family structure. The extended relatives, cousins, and half-siblings retained their positions in the administration, their loyalty secured through steady employment and occasional small grants of land. Khufu began compiling personal instructions for the future ruler. In a quiet chamber away from the main corridors, he dictated to trusted scribes a series of papyrus rolls. These documents outlined the key principles he had followed: the importance of accurate records in every department, the need to maintain temple offerings without draining state reserves, the value of fair but firm treatment of nomarchs, and the necessity of regular inspections at Giza even after completion. He described the pyramid's final elements, the capstone yet to be placed, the sealing of the entrance after burial, and emphasized that the complex must receive perpetual endowments so that priests could perform daily offerings indefinitely. Each roll ended with a reminder that Mart depended on consistency. Sudden changes invited chaos. He reviewed the drafts himself, correcting phrasing for clarity and adding details where memory supplied them. The completed set was sealed and stored in a secure chest within the palace archive, with a duplicate placed in a chamber near the pyramid site. He also prepared the court for the eventual transition. In private meetings with the vizier and senior officials, he spoke plainly about the succession without naming Khafre outright. He reminded them of their oaths of loyalty to the throne itself, not to any individual, and stressed that the double crown passed with the last breath of the king. The men listened in silence. They had served long enough to understand the unspoken message. Khufu instructed them to continue their duties exactly as before when the time came. No hasty promotions, no redistribution of offices unless clearly necessary. These conversations happened sparingly, spaced across several years so that the idea settled gradually rather than startling anyone. Family discussions grew more direct in the later evenings. Khufu gathered his wives and older children in the private garden after the lamps were lit. He spoke of the kingdom's condition, the granaries full, the trade routes open, the pyramid nearing its capstone. He explained that the throne required the same steady hand it had always needed, and that one among them had demonstrated the necessary qualities through years of service. He did not single out Khafre by name in these gatherings. The family already sensed the direction from his assignments and the time spent together. The atmosphere remained calm, no rivalry surfaced openly, no pleas for favour. The children listened, asked occasional questions about specific duties, and returned to their routines with the understanding that the matter would resolve itself in due time. Khufu also ensured the practical details of burial arrangements. He reviewed the final preparations for the burial chamber, the granite sarcophagus already in place, the canopic jars carved from alabaster waiting in storage, the ritual equipment, Ushabti figures, amulets, the golden mask being crafted by the finest artisans in Memphis. He visited the pyramid site one last time to walk the mortuary temple corridors, checking that the offering tables were aligned and the reliefs depicted him correctly presenting to the gods. The priests assigned to the complex received their endowments, land, cattle, grain, in sealed decrees that guaranteed their service after his passing. He confirmed these endowments personally with the high priest of Ptah, ensuring the temple would continue its role without interruption. In his private hours he reflected on the long arc of his reign. The kingdom had grown stronger, more stable administration, secure frontiers, a monument that would endure. He had avoided the excesses that weakened earlier rulers, kept the people fed, and honoured the gods consistently. The succession preparations formed the final piece, transferring the burden without breaking the continuity that had sustained Egypt for so many generations. 18. Section 18. Death and Contemporary. Views Khufu's final days arrived quietly, in keeping with the steady rhythm he had followed throughout his life. He had reached an advanced age likely into his 60s or beyond, though exact years were never recorded in the way later cultures counted them. The palace physicians had noted a gradual weakening over the previous seasons, less strength in the legs during walks along the Nile bank, a need for more rest after the morning audiences, an occasional discomfort in the chest that they treated with herbal infusions and rest. Khufu accepted these changes without complaint, continuing his routines as far as his body allowed. He rose for the dawn offering when possible, sat through shortened audiences, and reviewed the last reports from Giza by lamplight in the evenings. One morning he simply did not rise from his bed. The attendants found him resting peacefully, his breathing shallow but calm. The physicians were summoned at once. They applied cooling cloths and administered the usual remedies, but the end came without struggle. Word moved through the palace corridors in low voices. Servants closed the shutters to soften the light. Priests entered to begin the preliminary rituals, and the vizier quietly informed the family members who were present. Khafre arrived first, followed by the other sons and daughters. They stood around the bed in silence, while the priests washed the body according to custom, using natron and scented water from the Nile. No public announcement came immediately. The court observed a period of private mourning while preparations began. The body was taken to the embalmer's workshop near the palace, where the full process unfolded over 70 days. The priests and embalmers worked methodically. Removal of the organs, drying with natron salts, wrapping in fine linen strips impregnated with resin, placement of amulets, and protective scarabs between the layers. The heart remained in place, as tradition required for the weighing in the afterlife. The canopic jars, each carved from alabaster, and topped with the head of a protective son of Horus, received the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines. The process followed the exact formulas used for earlier kings, with Khufu's name inscribed on every protective item. When complete, the mummy was placed in the granite sarcophagus that had waited in the burial chamber for years. The funeral procession moved from Memphis to Giza during the cooler season, when the Nile carried the royal barge easily downstream. The body travelled in a gilded wooden coffin inside a shrine-shaped shrine boat, accompanied by smaller boats carrying family members, priests, and officials. Crowds gathered along both banks, throwing lotus flowers into the water and chanting the traditional laments. The people had known Khufu as the builder of the Great Pyramid, the son of Sneferu who had continued the age of monuments. They saw his passing not as an end, but as the natural transition to the next phase of his existence among the imperishable stars. At Giza, the procession reached the Valley Temple, where purification rites took place beside the river. Priests performed the opening of the mouth ceremony on the mummy, using special tools to restore the senses for the afterlife. The coffin then moved up the long causeway, carried by bearers while priests chanted and musicians played harps and sistra. The mortuary temple received the body for final offerings, bread, beer, oxen, incense, before the sarcophagus was taken through the entrance passage and placed in the granite burial chamber. The ceiling followed immediately. Granite plugs slid into position, blocking stones lowered into the ascending corridor, the entrance filled with rubble and disguised under the casing. The pyramid's capstone had been set earlier. Now the monument stood complete, its white limestone sides gleaming under the sun. Among those who lived during his time, Khufu was remembered as a strong ruler who demanded much but provided steadily. The workers at Giza spoke of him as the king who kept the bread ovens full and the medical tents staffed, even when the upper courses rose high and the work grew harder. They respected his regular inspections and the way he increased rations during difficult seasons. Officials in the nomes recalled his prompt responses to reports of flood damage or disease, the way he adjusted quotas fairly rather than punish entire districts for local problems. Priests in Memphis and Heliopolis viewed him as dutiful, never neglecting offerings, always ensuring temple estates remained productive. His name appeared in temple reliefs as the one who presented to the gods, and his endowments guaranteed their service long after he was gone. The pyramid itself shaped how people saw him. From Memphis across the river, its shape dominated the horizon, a constant presence that reminded everyone of the effort required to maintain cosmic order. Common folk in the fields and markets referred to it simply as the Great Monument of Khufu, the place where the king would live forever among the stars. They told their children stories of the thousands who built it, the ramps that reached the sky, the blocks dragged up one by one. The monument became proof of his reign's strength. No earlier king had achieved such scale, and none since would match it in the same way. In the court, among those who had served him directly, he was seen as reserved but fair. He spoke little in large gatherings, preferred facts to flattery, and rewarded competence without favoritism. The vizier and senior officials who had worked under both Sneferu and Khufu noted the continuity his son had learned the same habits of careful oversight and measured response. The family mourned privately but continued the rituals at the mortuary temple, ensuring the offerings continued as he had arranged. Over time, his name entered the king lists carved in later temples, placed between his father Sneferu and his son Khafre. Scribes copied his cartouche onto papyrus for administrative records, and priests invoked it during the daily rites at Giza. The pyramid endured as his most visible legacy, outlasting the mud brick houses of Memphis, the wooden boats on the Nile, and the lives of everyone who had known him. Travellers from distant lands would later describe it in wonder, but for those who had lived under his rule, it was simply the marker of a time when the two lands were fed, the temples supplied, the borders secure, and the king had fulfilled his duty to the gods and the people. The plateau at Giza fell quiet after the final sealing. The ramps were dismantled, their materials reused elsewhere. The worker village gradually emptied as seasonal labourers returned to their fields. The permanent staff remained to maintain the complex, performing the daily offerings in the mortuary temple. The Nile continued its annual cycle, the inundation brought new silt, and the land remained fertile. Khufu's name faded from daily speech, but lived on in the stone that rose above the desert, a silent witness to the order he had upheld during his years on the throne. The kingdom moved forward under Khafre, who followed the path his father had prepared. The administration continued without major change. The granaries stayed full, the expeditions sailed as before. The people accepted the new ruler as the natural successor, and life along the river resumed its familiar pattern. Khufu passed into the afterlife he had prepared so carefully, leaving behind a land that was stronger for his steady hand, and a monument that would speak his name long after every voice that had known him fell silent. The pyramid stands complete on the plateau, its casing stones catching the last light of day. The Nile flows steadily below, carrying boats laden with grain and timber. In the quiet of evening the air cools, and the desert stretches empty toward the west. The day's work has ended, the lamps in Memphis flicker out one by one, and the land settles into rest. The order Khufu maintained continues, carried forward by those who remain. The monument endures, silent and certain, as the stars appear overhead. Rest now. The journey through his life has reached its end. The Nile will rise again tomorrow, the fields will green, and the world will turn as it always has.